This is hopefully the end of Thomas Jefferson. He's a very complicated guy, talking about Louisiana, the Lewis and Clark expedition, and then shading into James Madison and the War of 1812, which will probably be the next slide. John Adams said it best. Thomas Jefferson, unlike Adams, who's not very direct, Thomas Jefferson is pliant and yielding in manner, but steady as a magnet in aim. And his aim was always democracy. How do you get democracy? Education, and everybody owns their own land. And that's the interest in Louisiana. Jefferson had his eye on Louisiana before it was even an issue. Very complicated issue. As we talked about last time, Spain owned it, which is why Louisiana has all those different cultures in it, particularly New Orleans. And then it was given to Napoleon as a bribe, basically not to invade Spain. Napoleon wants to get rid of it. Monroe comes up with $10 million just for the port of New Orleans. And again, if you look at those maps, you can see why New Orleans is important. And it's sold for $50 million, 2 cents an acre, the whole thing, because Napoleon is sick of North America and needs his troops and his money elsewhere to conquer the rest of Europe. Even before we bought it, Jefferson had organized an expedition, an exploring expedition, to see what was there. Why? Because we're still looking for a Northwest Passage. The goal was to find a river route, there's no land transportation, to find a river route that might go to the Pacific, and people didn't know what was out there. We didn't have any idea what was west of the Mississippi, including the Spanish, who did very little exploring. So Lewis and Clark are sent out in 1803. You have slides 15 to 21. Meriwether Lewis was Thomas Jefferson's personal secretary, a good friend of his, a well-educated Virginia gentleman who had scientific training so he could do the scientific measurements, chart his longitude and latitude, and keep good records. Clark, William Clark, is the youngest of the Clark brothers, younger brother of George Rogers Clark from the Revolution. He is a frontiersman. He is a 6'4", red-haired Scotchman. He knows Indians. He knows how to survive on the frontier. So in many ways, this is kind of an ideal combination. There is a great book about this expedition called Undaunted Courage that was written about 10 or 15 years ago. The expedition is one of the great exploring expeditions in world history, not just in our history, and well worth reading if you have the time sometime. Okay, so there's scientific motives. What exactly is out there? Number 2, is there a Northwest Passage? They are worried about Spain because Spain is out in the southwest. They're not worried about France. Spain never okayed any trip through its territory. But Lewis and Clark get together, 32 soldiers, 10 civilians. Lewis, of course, is a Virginia gentleman, so he brings his own personal slave named York with him. They have 2 interpreters, 2 French Canadians who speak a multitude of Indian languages, who supposedly know the terrain, and one of them has a 17-year-old new wife named Sacagawea, who becomes the real hero of the expedition. One of the interpreters disappeared. The other one Sacagawea's husband, ended up drunk and useless most of the time. So here is a 2.5-year expedition. They traveled a total of about 8,000 miles. They carried, you can see the boats. They had 2 custom-made boats built. They carried 600 pounds of ammunition with them. They covered anything from 20 to 30 miles a day. 30 miles a day is from where you're standing probably to downtown Austin. They used so much energy that by their own records, they were eating, they had 2 professional hunters, 2 full-time hunters with them as well. They were eating 8 pounds of meat per man per day. Think about that a little bit. They were burning off those calories and losing weight. A pound of lean meat is about 600 to 800 calories. So they go out. You can see their route up the Missouri River against the current for 1,500 miles or so. How did they do that? When they had a wind, they used sails. Otherwise, they got out on the bank and with a tow rope pulled the boats. These are boats that carry about 20 tons of supplies, trading goods, food, instruments, etc. They get over the mountains. They have to leave the boats. They go on horseback over the Rocky Mountains. On the other side of the Rocky Mountains, they traded for Indian canoes and went by canoe down the Columbia River to the Pacific, wintered on the Pacific Ocean, and headed back up the Columbia River, most of the time walking against the current, and pick up their boats and finally get to go downstream on the Missouri River. Two amazing things on this expedition. Number one, they are gone 2.5 years, 8,000 miles in the middle of nowhere with enemy tribes all over the place with all kinds of things they had never seen. Americans really in 1803 had never been west of the Mississippi. They had no idea what a bison was when they saw one. They had no idea what a prairie dog was. They had no idea what a plains grizzly was. There are no grizzly bears east of the Mississippi. When they saw their first one, it almost killed the two guys that stumbled on it. It took 8 rifles to bring down that grizzly bear. So they are risking their lives. They never knew if around the corner there was a huge waterfall that would smash all the boats and destroy everything. But they make it 2.5 years with one guy dying. And that guy died of an appendicitis attack, which they could do nothing about at the time. So they don't lose a man. The other thing that's amazing about it, the minute they leave from St. Louis on the Mississippi River, it is a total democracy on the trail. Not only do all the men have a vote on any decision, where should we camp tonight, which branch of the river should we take, how do we deal with these tribes, should we go a different way, but the black slave also has a vote. And Sacagawea, the Indian woman, she has a vote too. She was vital to the expedition. For one thing, she knew both French and English through her husband and several different Indian languages. When they came to tribes, she was born a Shoshone, but captured as a child and traded through several different tribes. So she knew 3 or 4 Indian languages besides sign language. When they got to tribes, she is the negotiator. She is the translator for everybody. So they get all the way through and back. At one point, in some rapids, the wooden box holding all their instruments and their journals falls overboard. And it's not any of the men, not any of the voyagers, the French-Canadian boatmen who jump overboard. It is Sacagawea who jumped overboard, got the box back to shore, and saved the instruments and all the records from the expedition. In the middle of it, after the first winter camp, she gives birth to a son. So she is doing everything these guys are doing, 17, 18 years old, plus carrying a baby on her back. The son, Jean-Baptiste, grew up, was raised, adopted almost, by Clark in St. Louis, who was appointed Indian Affairs Director after the expedition. He spent 6 years in Europe, spoke fluent French, German, and Spanish, came back and became a guide to a number of other expeditions himself. So they make it there. What have they found? Is there a water route to the Pacific? Not all the way. The mountains are in between, and they didn't know that when they started. But they bring back boxes and boxes of specimens. They bring back a live prairie dog. They bring back a live coyote pup. All of these things are brought back as scientific, souvenirs, I guess. Okay, William Clark became Indian agent for the Louisiana Territory. Meriwether Lewis is talked about as a possible presidential candidate. He became governor of the Louisiana Territory and also worked to protect Native Americans when he was there. He was returning east. There was political ambitions for him. And someplace on the voyage, on the walk back east, he's traveling by himself. He is found in a lonely little country inn with a bullet. He died the next day. Suicide? Murder? He had political enemies. We don't know what was going on. Suicide, possibly. There was a lot of depression in his family, but his career was rising. Why commit suicide at this time after getting to the Pacific Ocean and back? We don't know, but we don't know what happened in that case. So we do know now, thanks to Lewis and Clark's expedition, what is out in the Pacific. Okay, Thomas Jefferson's second term. He's dealing with the Barbary Pirates. That was an ongoing issue, but the main issue is what is going on in the Atlantic. France and England are at war. They are at war off and on for 30 years until Napoleon is defeated. And we have no neutral rights at sea. As a non-combatant, America should be able to trade with everybody. France said you can't sail because you're going to send it to England, which was true 95% of the time. England said you can't sail because you will send things to France. So both are seizing American ships. Britain was the bigger problem. She was seizing about 75% of the ships that were lost. The sailors on these ships, these are cargo ships, so they may have anything from 50 to 30 men on them, are impressed. This is forced labor. They are essentially prisoners. As John Adams said, Britain is enslaving our seamen. They are being whipped like slaves, which was true of everybody in the British Navy as well. Britain did not see America, did not recognize America as an independent country. When Britain stopped a ship, she saw the sailors as British citizens. So she felt the right to impress them. Some of them actually were British sailors who had escaped basically from British ships and were now working for American cargo ships, maybe 20% of them. But most are American citizens. Americans are totally outraged. What can we do about it? Again, Thomas Jefferson, if you reduce the Navy and the Army, not much. Britain had 1,000 warships, including 100 battleships that had over 60 cannon apiece. Britain needed to man her Navy 10,000 men a year. She couldn't get them at home. The Navy was a miserable job, so she is basically stealing them off of American ships. What are you going to do, Thomas Jefferson? He doesn't have the military force to deal with it, so what he proposes, and Congress voted, but he's blamed for it, an embargo. An embargo is a stoppage of trade. Nothing goes. And it's just proof that even geniuses like Thomas Jefferson get things wrong once in a while. Britain could live with an embargo. She has places around the world to trade. America cannot. Almost all our wealth, our whole economy depends on shipping things to Europe, basically England. What Thomas Jefferson is trying to do, if no ships leave port, no ships will be captured, no crews will be captured. It made perfect sense, but what happens in reality, the law of unintended consequences, is no ships leave port, the whole economy collapses. Within a year, particularly on the Atlantic coast, particularly in New England, which is the seafaring area, there was a huge depression. Examples, one town in Massachusetts, 50% of the town were on charity just to eat. Shipyards closed right and left. In New York City, a significant percentage of the population, over 2%, was in debtor's prison. They couldn't pay their debts. There was no economy. There were no jobs. The whole economy collapsed. Being Americans, how do we deal with this? We immediately begin smuggling. When Americans are caught smuggling, sympathetic juries pretty much let them off without any penalty or very light penalties. The market is glutted. We have more corn, we have more wheat than we can use. People start smuggling to Canada where there was more of a market, but this is a total disaster. Upshot, basically, Thomas Jefferson, 3 days before he leaves office in 1808, repealed the Embargo Act, and everybody was delighted to see it. Totally a failure. He leaves office in disgrace. Everybody who thought Thomas Jefferson was a national hero after Lewis and Clark expedition and the Louisiana Purchase now can't stand the sight of his name. So he leaves. He goes back to Monticello, never really left Monticello again. He goes back, as he says, to my family, my farm, and my books. Totally sick of politics, which was not his interest in the first place. He continues to work with Madison, who is his replacement as president, elected overwhelmingly, and helps direct policy. The two of them are leaders of the Republican Party. He does a lot of experimental botany. He has all kinds of plants growing in his garden to determine the best varieties for America and spread them out between all his friends. I'm talking experimental gardens. Now, he wasn't doing it. The slaves were doing it. They're the ones who built the gardens. They're the ones who took care of the plants. But he was out there actually directly involved with this. He wanted to build a national botanical gardens, which we did later on, but not at Monticello. For example, He planted in his own gardens 40 kinds of kidney beans. He had hundreds of varieties of everything. He'd pick out the 2 best ones, take the seeds, and distribute them in Western Virginia. 20 years, after 20 years of not speaking to each other, Jefferson and Adams, both both have daughters die. Jefferson's only surviving daughter, the oldest one, was fine. The second one dies in childbirth, giving birth to her first child. Abigail Adams, the eldest daughter, Nabby, she dies of breast cancer. Abby Adams writes to Jefferson, consoling him, saying, "Sorry to hear about your daughter's death." Jefferson immediately writes back, saying the same thing about their daughter's death. They didn't write after that. Abigail Adams, being an old Puritan, says, "I'm sorry for your loss, but I do not forgive you for what you did to John Adams." All of the slanders that were said. A mutual friend of theirs talks to both of them, writes to both of them, and says, "The two of you should really, you work together, you should make up." John Adams writes Jefferson in 1812 and says, "I have always loved you. I still love you, Thomas Jefferson," in a very platonic way. "We work together." And Jefferson writes back, and from that point on, the last 15 years of their life, they wrote long, extensive letters back and forth. They never saw each other again, but they wrote back and forth constantly, talking about every political of the issue of the day, except for one. John Adams would bring up slavery regularly. Thomas Jefferson completely ignored it, would not answer, would not talk about slavery, would not give his opinions. July 4th, 1826 comes along, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which both of them were involved with. There are only 3 signers alive. Jefferson and Adams are 2 of them. They are asked to give speeches. They are both too ill to appear publicly. But Jefferson does actually write out a speech that someone else gives. 350 miles apart. They are both dying. They are both on their deathbeds. Remember, Sally Hemings and Jefferson's entire family is there. Jefferson dies at the age of 83 in the morning of July 4th. 5 hours later, John Adams, who had slipped into a coma, revives briefly. He asks, "What day is it?" And they say, "President Adams, it is July 4th. And John Adams' last words were, "Jefferson still lives. He beat me again," in other words. He didn't know 350 miles away Jefferson had died a couple hours before he did. So they never saw each other, but they both died simultaneously almost on the same day, July 4th, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. James Madison. I'm starting with slide 26, some portraits of him. You can tell from the official portrait of James Madison, this is no George Washington, this is no Thomas Jefferson, this isn't even a John Adams. This guy does not look healthy, and that's pretty accurate. This is a tiny little guy. He was about 5'3", which is small even for that time, and weighed at his heaviest 110 pounds. So you're talking about a guy who looks a lot like a woman or a boy rather than a man, next to all of these 6'3" guys, 6'2" guys. He did have health problems. He had all kinds of stomach problems. He was very frail from childhood. He was sickly. Lucky thing he was born in Virginia. Family was pretty wealthy, as you can see from the family home. In the next 2 slides, they lived pretty well. Granddad owned 28 slaves and 10,000 acres. Parents inherit from them. John Adams is the eldest of 8 children. 5 of the 8 died before they were 7 years old. John Adams, who was sickly most of his life, was convinced, "I'm never even going to make it. I won't even make it to adulthood," and everybody assumed he'd die young. He actually lived to be 85 years old. He was one of the oldest surviving children in his family. His parents both were very long-lived. His father lived to be 85 as well, and his mother died at 97. So he does inherit the family property, Montpelier, but He's living with his mother, and his parents really have control of it until he's in his 70s because they lived forever. Montpelier, he inherits 5,000 acres and about 100 slaves. And again, he would call himself a farmer, just like the others. He wore these old, unattractive black suits. He had a very quiet little voice. He's a little guy. And he never, ever spoke publicly because he was an epileptic. He was always afraid in public of having epileptic seizures. So he refused to speak in public. He was a very shy, retiring guy, but a brilliant political thinker. He and John Adams are the great political minds here. And I've mentioned when we talked about the Constitution is James Madison's Constitution. He's the one who really put the thing together. As Jefferson said of him, never have I seen so much mind in so little matter. So intellectually a powerhouse, socially a timid little mouse. He is part of the Virginia dynasty. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, all Virginians living fairly close to each other. In fact, James Monroe actually bought a piece of property in back of Thomas Jefferson's and could walk over and see him whenever he wanted. The only exception there is John Adams. So of our first 5 presidents, 4 of them are from Central Virginia. If you look at where presidents come from, we haven't elected a Virginian since then, but 4 of the 5 were part of the Virginia dynasty, not genetically related, but all good friends from Virginia. James Madison's best asset, slide 29, is his wife, Dolly. She is everything James is not. She is lively, she is vivacious, she was attractive. She was a new North Carolina raised, fairly wealthy family, raised a Quaker on a plantation. But the family freed their slaves and moved to Philadelphia. She was married. Yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia after they moved there kills her husband, kills one of her 2 sons, and killed 3 brothers within a year. So huge losses in her family. Aaron Burr, ironically enough, introduced James Madison to Dolly Madison. James Madison is 17 years older. They know each other for a grand total of 4 months. She was taller than him. She was very physically strong. And she proposed to him after only 4 months. And this was unheard of in the 1800s for a woman to propose to a man. So obviously there was something going on there. As far as we know, they had a happy marriage, no kids at all, except her son from the original marriage whose husband had died. Her husband had died. That kid, James Madison raised as his own kid, and basically that guy bankrupted him. He was a gambler, he had illegitimate children, he was an alcoholic, and Madison's bailed him out again and again. James Madison at one point was paying off $40,000 in gambling debts at that time. That's over $1 million today. So, moral to the story is be careful of your children bankrupting you. Dolly Madison is the hit of Washington, D.C. She has parties, she has teas, everybody wants to get invited. And where is James the whole time? He's very quietly hiding up against the wall. He was not a public figure at all, but Dolly substituted for him. Very famously, in the War of 1812, when the British are coming to sack the White House, it is Dolly Madison who grabs the valuables, the silver, and particularly the famous portrait of George Washington, takes them in a wagon as the British are moving into Washington, D.C. Because her son bankrupted them, she died in poverty, living with friends. Madison and slavery. He always owned about 100 slaves. Only half of them were actually productive, always 10 to 12 house servants. The others were doing other things. He was, quote unquote, big quotes on this again, a good master. He never sold slaves. Even when he was going bankrupt, he would sell land. So he inherited 10,000 acres and died with less than 5. Treated slaves leniently, ordered his overseers never to hit or physically punish the slaves. The slaves themselves were recorded as seeing James Madison as a joke and took advantage of him. It's a touchy issue. We know that his grandfather, who started the plantation, who was also a fairly large slave owner, died from poison given by a slave. So this was never discussed in the family, but it's an odd relationship. James Madison clearly saw slaves as men, like Thomas Jefferson, not as property. He was very uneasy about slavery, but less outspoken than Thomas Jefferson. Free African Americans he saw as equals. He would occasionally have some over as dinner guests as well. But like Jefferson, he sees no solution. If you're going to free slaves, it must be gradual. How do you pay the owners? And the slaves must have some place to go. Both races have to be able to live with each other, and that's the solution they did not see as possible. Colonization, sending them back to Africa, yes, but not being together in the South. He retires after his second term, has 20 years before he dies, and he's slowly going broke, bailing out this stepson of his. Jefferson Adams died July 4th, 1826, 5 years later, the 30th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence being signed. James Monroe dies July 4th. This is completely accidental, but very, very strange. James Madison is very ill 5 years later. This is the 60th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 1836. It is late June, the last couple days of June. He's clearly very ill. He's clearly on his deathbed. And the doctors came to him and said, "Do you want medicines? Would you like to make it to the 4th?" And he said, "No, let me die." And he died in late June in 1836. He is the last survivor, the last surviving member of the Philadelphia Convention that signed the Declaration. And here's a guy, very frail, epileptic, who thought he was going to die before the age of 20, and he ends up being the last survivor. So we'll talk about the only important thing in Madison's administration, which is the War of 1812, next time. Thanks. Please stay safe.